Thanks very much. There's only really one direction this can go, and it's down, and that's too bad. I'm going to talk, this is really my second slide, but we're talking about enhancing learning, and we're talking about the future, and the only way to really understand the future, I think, is to understand the past. Now, I should tell you that the kind of crazy reason I'm standing here before you, as you would imagine for someone talking about education, the future, and all sorts of things like that, is that my academic discipline is actually 14th century heresy. So, I don't know. We'll see how that goes. So I'm going to take you on kind of a weird journey, and I want to think, first of all, about information and what I think are the three ages of information. And the first age is the age of hands. Because everything in that first age, from the 15th century back, required you to be either within hand's reach of a person or required information to be copied by hand. Now, we had these great multimedia manuscripts that changed people's lives, but all of them had to be copied by hand. And in fact, you had to go and visit the manuscripts. They didn't travel. There are stories of people traveling thousands and thousands of kilometers, which is crazy because the kilometer hadn't been invented yet. Thousands of kilometers to go visit a manuscript because it only existed in one place in the world. And that led to a challenge, a problem. And that problem was access. How do you get to these manuscripts? It's impossible. It meant only a few people could do it, and that limited what people could do. So we invented a technology. We invented the lecture. Now, lecture comes from the Latin word for reading. I'm doing a lecture right now. Am I reading? It's kind of weird. But at its origin, the function of the medieval lecture was the teacher read a book out loud so that the students could make a copy of it. And so what we had to do, what is the primary focus of the medieval classroom, by the way? What's the subject matter mostly? This is your chance to participate. Religion. And what happens if someone's distracted, they're looking out the window, they're not paying attention, they copy it down wrong? What happens? People go to hell. So, you have to focus the learners on their task. You seat them in rows next to each other so they can't talk to each other. Like, it's very hard for you right now to talk to each other. Oh, some of you are doing it. I see you. Right? And you put the teacher at the front so that the teacher can watch and say, you, pay attention. Because it's very important stuff. That's the origin of lecture. I read a book out loud so students can make a copy of it. But then we developed a technology that solved that problem. The printed book. And this is amazing. For the first time in human history, book after book after book, they can come off this machine, and we suddenly have this explosion of information. Not just a few hundred books. The largest libraries of the Middle Ages have just a few hundred books. Now, libraries of millions of books. This is the National Library in Brazil, so I took this picture. This is a fraction of it. It's just this amazing expanse, and it's brilliant. Except there's another problem. How do you find anything in that place? That's a lot of stuff. Finding becomes the challenge of the second age, the age of books. So, dear heavens, what do we do? Well, first of all, we switch lecture. Now, the teacher just repeats the notes so that it saves you time. Because think about the time. Many of you are my age or around my age. Many of you spent your early years learning how to find stuff, right? There were all these hours and hours spent figuring out how to find things, and it was a crazy long process to do it. It took at least an hour to find anything you wanted to find in the library. And so the job of teachers was to point you in the right direction, to synthesize all that stuff and save you time, because all they did, they said the stuff, you copied it down it saved you enormous amounts of time. That was the second age. And then something else happened. Those of you old enough to remember, do you remember when the card catalog got digitized? And then you could type in a search term, although you still had to write down the numbers and then go wander around the library to find where that thing was, right? But it led to the third age, our current age, the age of data. So here's the question. We had the challenge of the first age is access. The challenge of the second age is finding. What's the challenge of the third age? And let me give you one example of it. Has anyone ever caramelized onions before? Well, let me suggest you Google caramelizing onions right now. Caramelized onions are delicious. They're brown, and they've got that just lovely kind of nutty, caramely flavor. Oh, amazing. And if you look right now on the web, it will tell you that it takes about 5 minutes to caramelize onions. Now, this guy, Tom Skoka, he wrote an article about this because he thought, that doesn't seem to make sense. I've never been able to caramelize onions that quickly. And so what he did was he tested this some years ago and debunked it. In fact, it is impossible to caramelize onions in 5 minutes. No less an authority than Julia Child says it takes 40 minutes to properly caramelize onions. And so he tried all these recipes, and either he ended up with onions that were barely cooked or onions that were just black and unuseful. So he wrote this article about it and put it up, case solved. But there was a problem, because in it, at the beginning of the article, he quoted several sources that said you could caramelize onions in 5 minutes. And then he proceeded to debunk that because he had tested it and tried it and made it happen. And he posted this article, and Google's search engine scraped it, and they scraped only the top part of the article, and they said, Tom Skoka says you can caramelize onions in 5 minutes. Yeah. The problem of the current age, and we've heard this already from two speakers. Thanks for setting me up and kind of ruining everything also. It's terrible to be the last person to go. I have nothing new to say. The problem of the third age is, how do I know what's real? But that's not necessarily a new problem. Because I think, actually, it's a problem that's persisted for some time, and it has to do with how schools teach. Now, how many of you have ever had a science class of any sort? Oh, good, this will be easy. Because usually what our schools teach is they teach this process of assembly. Put these things together, copy this, do this. You got this product done. You've learned it. Progress. But let's see if that works. You've all had science. You've all learned some science. You've gone through the instructional methodology. What I'd like to do is ask you a question. So let's imagine that I have a steel plate. I am going to heat that steel plate. I'm not going to melt it. I'm going to heat that steel plate. And I'm wondering what happens to the dimensions of the steel plate when I heat it.
Bigger.
It gets bigger. Yes. Why does that happen? Molecules. What I've done is I've added energy to the system, right? And the energy excites those molecules, and they start bouncing off of each other with more and more energy. And as they do that, they push each other away from each other. They get less dense. This is the reason hot air balloons rise as well. It gets less dense, right? So what's going to happen is it's going to push out at all the edges. So the plate is going to get a little bit wider and a little bit longer and a little bit thicker. Does this sound familiar? Yes? Good. Now, I am going to put a hole in the middle of that steel plate, and I am once again going to heat it. And what I'd like you to tell a neighbor is what happens to that hole. Does it get bigger? Does it get smaller? Or does it stay the same size? Now, there is a rule. You are not allowed to explain your answer. You can only say bigger, smaller, or same. What happens to the circumference of that hole? Ready? Go. Stop. All right. Now, the answer to this is very, very important. So we'll talk about it later. In the meantime, there's this guy, Derek Muller. Now, Derek Muller, he was a physics PhD student at the University of Sydney, and he was looking at Khan Academy videos. Do you know Khan Academy videos? Yeah. So what he wanted to see was, how well do Khan Academy videos work at teaching physics? Because it's not just maths anymore. There's all kinds of Khan Academy things. So he wanted to see what would happen. So what he did is he gave a couple of cohorts of people, he gave them a pretest of their basic knowledge of physics, and they scored, on average, 6 out of 22. You're excited. And then he showed them Khan Academy videos, and he asked them how they felt about those videos. And people said, oh, they were really helpful, they were really clear, I understand a lot, they made a lot of sense, really good. And then he gave them a post-test, and they scored 6.2 out of 22. No fundamental difference. And here's what he said in his research. This is from his dissertation. Students have existing ideas about scientific phenomena. If the video presents scientific concepts in a clear, well-illustrated way, students believe they are learning, but they do not engage with the media on a deep enough level to realize that what was presented differs from their prior knowledge. In fact, there was a five-step process that students went through, that these test subjects went through. So, first, they thought they knew it already, so, and these are the words of one of the study subjects, they did not pay utmost attention to the video. Because of that, they didn't recognize that what was presented differed from what they were already thinking. Because of that, they didn't learn a thing. And here's the sort of cherry on top for you. They got more confident in the incorrect ideas that they were thinking before. It's always applause for incorrect ideas. I'm an American, so we've got a lot of incorrect ideas that get applause. So what he did was he made videos that started like the Khan Academy videos, started exactly the same way, but in the middle they sort of slammed people into this problem. And he asked people how they felt about those videos. It's very frustrating. I don't like it. They weren't helpful. They were confusing. I didn't learn anything. They were not good. He gave those people a post-test, and they scored 12. 12 out of 22. Which brings us back to our plate. Now, it's kind of hard to see, but show of hands, how many people think the hole stays the same size? A few of you. How many people think the hole gets bigger? A couple of you. How many people think the hole gets smaller? Dear heavens, almost the entire room. And it just makes perfect logical sense, right? Because, of course, as it's heating, it's pushing out all the sides. It's going to push out at the sides of that hole and that. Hang on, I'm just thinking for a minute here. If I had a series of dots evenly spaced around that hole, and that hole were getting smaller, would those dots be getting closer together or further apart? Closer together. I was thinking, now, if those were not dots, if those were molecules, that would mean the molecules are getting closer together, but I thought we said that when something heats, it gets less dense, and the molecules push. So what happens to the hole? Now here's the problem. All of you thought completely logically. You were absolutely wrong, but you thought completely logically. You unfortunately did not think like scientists. Although apparently you were able to get a job despite the fact that you're incompetent failures. Here's the problem. You thought, aha, it pushes out at all the edges. That's an edge in the middle. It's going to push out at that, and it's going to get smaller. But let me change the way I explain this. What would happen if I simply drew a circle in the middle of that plate? If I stretched the plate in those directions, would that circle get bigger or smaller? Of course it would get bigger. Gah! Fundamentally, an instructionist regime where we simply have people repeat information is not going to enhance learning for this century or any other. It turns out that if we're in the business of helping people to know, then we need to understand a few things. First of all, knowing about a thing is not the same as knowing about it, as knowing it, rather. And that means that learning about a thing is not the same as knowing, and that means that learning about a thing is not the same as learning. Do you know the DIKW pyramid? Has anyone seen this before? Data, information, knowledge, wisdom. So data put into structures, frameworks, and algorithms becomes information. Information put into meaningful context becomes knowledge. Knowledge enculturated becomes wisdom. That's the stuff that's really about content. That, the knowledge requires a context, a meaningful context, and wisdom requires a community of people. Now, we've already heard this before, but those are things that machines are great at. If you think your job is the delivery or conveyance of information, the putting of data into meaningful structures and frameworks and algorithms, you will be replaced by a machine, and so will your students. That's what humans do. And that's the work ahead. And it's not the work ahead, it's the work behind, too. It's the work we've been doing for all of human history. How do we make meaning, knowledge, wisdom? Now, those three things, content and community and context, are something I want to think a lot about. And although I don't have any time to explain it here, if you come to my workshop later, we'll talk about this. It'll be fun. But here's what I mean by content. The facts and data, the concepts and structures into which those facts and data are put, the tools you use to process that, and the skills you need to use those tools. All of that is content. For community, of course, the leaders and teachers and mentors in a student's life, and the community of co-learners, but also the sources and resources that are outside of the learning context, the classroom, that can be brought in, and importantly, audience. What's the first thing a little kid does when they've just learned something? Look, 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 look. Yes, of course, because it's part of what completes the circle of our learning. When I can demonstrate it to someone else, when I can show it to you, it's real. If your classroom is cut off from an audience, the learning isn't complete. And by context, I mean the learning spaces where we try and fail. We've already heard about the importance of failure. It's critically important. It shows us where we are. But if we're just practicing and practicing and practicing and nothing gets real, it just gets boring. So there have to be making spaces as well, where I'm expected to perform and do the real work. And I mean place, the physical characteristics of a place, the equipment that it has, its configuration, but also environment. And I mean that in this kind of broad way, the social, cultural, historical context that make this meaningful. The reason that Palma is different from Madrid, the reason that every different school within a city is different, because of that cultural heritage that can be very, very idiosyncratic, very local. And all of these, of course, they're not separate entities. They're part of a single structure. They all influence the other. Dig below the surface, and you can't disentangle them. And of course, what has to happen is that as students learn, there has to be this progression. These things have to keep growing and getting bigger. This is an organic and human process. So this is a model I've been working on for, 10 years or so, thinking about how to build deeper and richer kinds of context and content and community, because almost all the time we just talk about content. We're going to deliver it more efficiently. We're going to make it more acceptable. And it's exactly the stuff that Derek Muller says doesn't make a difference. The cleaner it is, the more beautiful it is, the less impact it has. So how do we make that meaningful? How do we connect those things together? Information is not as powerful as activities, and activities are not as powerful as making. If you want to solve the challenge of the third age, do it by making stuff with the information people have in a meaningful context in a community of learners. Making, I think, is the answer. So, what does it look like? How do we figure out this kind of learning by making thing? Well, we've been kind of working on this fourfold structure, and it's kind of weird. Because what happens in most schools, I think, is if I just brought you a big bucket of parts and said, make something useful, some of you could do that. But a lot of you would go, I've never done this before. So let's start with some direct instruction. Okay, let me have you put some stuff together. Let me have you make something. We're all going to make the same thing. We're going to start at the same place. But that's not where we're going to stop. That's a platform. And the reason we build a platform, we've talked about failure. If I have a platform, I can't fall through it. It stops me from going further into collapse, right? So that's our foundation. That's our platform. Then we're going to play with some stuff. Okay, you've got the characteristics of the thing. What would happen if you changed those numbers around? What would happen if you made that a little bit longer or a little bit? What would happen if you changed that into another language? How would you, if you start with something and then tinker with it, play with it, part of what you're doing, and we've known this for a long time, is you're building mental models. You're testing stuff out. You're thinking like a scientist. Does this work? Tinkering becomes a really important part. And tinkering isn't hard. Tinkering isn't scary. You're just messing around with stuff. And once you've solidified that, then you can play. And in play, that's where we create. And play is the right word for this. Because that's how all young creatures learn, by play. Play is joyful. Play is crazy. Play doesn't have a test score at the end. Play is what you heard on that team of physicists. Ask the stupid question. That's play. What would happen if we did this? That's crazy, but it doesn't stop there. The last step is share. You've got to show it to other people. And that's not just, hey, look at this thing. Okay, that's competition, comparison, collaboration, coordination. Let's put our things together and see if we can make an even bigger, better thing. Let's see whose thing is the most durable or the most elegant, or, which thing has best weatherproofing, or I don't know. You made that choice and I made this choice. Why did you make that choice? Let's think that out. When we share, when we bring those things into community, powerful things happen, and that solidifies the learning. So it looks something like this. In the assemble phase, everybody makes the same thing. And if that's where your school stops, really the only thing you can tell is people follow directions well or not well. But at Tinker, we start to mess with the edges of those things and change little aspects of them. And then at Play, we can start to do crazy stuff. And then we bring it all together in Share and see what happens. Why do we have to do this? Because the world faces wicked problems. And that wickedness is getting more and more powerful. We have to find a way to break stupidity and small-mindedness and selfish evil, because the world doesn't have a place for that anymore. Thanks very much. Thanks a lot.